There is a obviously significant difference between good stress and bad stress.
Mm-hmm.
And the real significant difference is that good stress is acute and very short term and happens in the right dosage. And bad stress does not happen in the right dosage. It's extreme and it's chronic.
Mental health problems, including complex PTSD, it's turning out can be very affected by your metabolic health. And this has been a huge interest for me lately. And I've now had the pleasure to interview Jeff Krasno, who is the founder and CEO of Commune and the author of the new book, Good Stress: The Health Benefits of Doing Hard Things. Now, I know when I heard this, I was like, aren't we supposed to take it easy and take care of ourselves? So I checked out the book. And it is astonishing how much correlation there is between the causes of chronic disease. We know there's an epidemic in the general population, and how the very symptoms of its onset match what it looks like to be living with the adult effects of childhood trauma. I have so many questions I want to ask Jeff. Here he is. Jeff Krasno, welcome to the Crappy Childhood Fairy.
So great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Jeff, I was surprised how relevant your book was to my experience as somebody who had early trauma as a kid, because the symptoms you're talking about with the chronic disease, which you describe as being from, the Big Macs, which I'm hoping you'll explain about that, and the culture of chronic ease. And I'm like, that's weird because the culture of chronic trauma does the same symptoms.
Mm.
Isn't that interesting? And so I would love if you would dive in and talk about, just give me that nutshell of the premise of your book, because I did not expect it to be this relevant to us, those of
Mm.
us with trauma.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about my work and to connect with you and your community.
Thank you.
Um, yeah, I was in the industry, if you will, of health and wellness for most of my adult life. I started a company called Wanderlust, which was this glorious, treacherous events business that traveled around the world in the name of wellness. We featured the biggest yoga and mindfulness teachers, and we did a lot of events across the United States and all over the world. And that kind of foray into health and wellness took a sharp U-turn into what I call wealth and hellness about 5 or 6 years ago. I found myself with all of the more sort of anodyne, common symptoms of modernity, brain fog, chronic fatigue, insomnia, the inability to concentrate, extreme irritability. I need to check my phone all of the time. All of these things that are quite abnormal, but we've actually normalized them. And then, of course, there were the physical presentations. Sometimes I categorize those as insults to my vanity. So I had, dad bod, that extra, layer of adiposity kind of around the middle. I had what my children love to remind me of as the boobs of man. Um, and I started to grow these sort of very unflattering little protuberances in my armpits and on the back of my neck. I later found out that those were symptoms of insulin resistance. People may have seen those on people's necks before.
Mm-hmm.
But these again are so ordinary presentations that we tend just to write them off as, oh, I just having a bad day. But then I got a bucket of cold water poured over my head, which was not a protocol at that juncture. It was actually a realization that I had a diabetes diagnosis. And like 93% of all Americans, I was not only metabolically dysfunctional, but that was well in my rearview mirror, that I had a serious chronic disease. And of course, that will propel you into a change. I started a lot of my work on the basis of intellectual curiosity, and then quickly it became sort of physical necessity. And I really had to examine the reasons why I was so sick, and by extension, why the world is so sick. Because, Anna, sadly, I'm not extraordinary in any way. All the symptoms that I just described makes me uncommonly ordinary. And so that inquest, led me to that thesis that much of chronic disease is the result of chronic ease. And I really had to take an inventory of my life and of modernity in general to really unpack how lifestyle, essentially the way we live, upends and in many cases hijacks our biology.
I've been hearing this from some different voices. I'm a fan of Casey Means' work and considering this for myself, and have noticed how quickly and profoundly I start to feel better when I start to follow just some basic things about food and sleep. Obviously, sleep, but that's, I always feel like, oh, but sleep, who can do that, right? But running a company and running a company as somebody who had this early stress that I do notice makes me kind of wonky compared to my peers, where I can really kind of slip off the beam very easily in terms of keeping my body kind of running smoothly. Stuff starts to go wrong. Earlier on, before I knew how to treat my own trauma symptoms, I had asthma, I had chronic back pain. I wasn't even 40 yet. I was 30 and I had these problems, horrible digestive problems all the time, migraines constantly, and it just went on and on and on. And when I learned to use a few techniques that help to immediately calm your nervous system, even though that's not what it was called then,
Mhm.
nobody knew about like nervous system regulation or dysregulation. But I learned to calm it, and then a lot of my health problems cleared up. And I've had health problems before, and things like medical accident injuries, things even I could not heal when I was under that level of stress.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so I was so intrigued in your book about how, when you talk about chronic ease, and I know what you're talking about, and I want you to tell us more about that, in a weird way, it's very stressful.
Yeah, I mean, we really need to reframe what we think of as a life of ease. Because that portrait of kind of Jeff at 8:30 p.m. reclining on a sofa in a temperature regulated room at a snuggly 72 degrees, binging his favorite show, Curb Your Enthusiasm, while door dashing up a pint of Chubby Hubby. I mean, that sounds like an absolutely delicious way to spend a Friday night or any night.
Mhm.
But it's really that is not the ease we're truly looking for. That might provide a short term salve to mask, our feelings of unhappiness or our perceived deficiencies. But really, that short term ease leads to a lot of long term dis-ease. And really, what we're looking for is a different kind of ease in life. And we know that ease when we experience it. We often experience it in when we're immersed in some sort of creative endeavor. Where linear time
Mhm.
starts to disappear, right? And we lose our sense of self.
Mhm.
It's really that sense of self, that clutch of your muscles that underwrites this feeling of the ego that I am some separate locus of attention crouching somewhere behind my eyes. And, that's often really leads to sort of feelings of separation and disconnection. We also feel that ease when we're involved in kind of bouts of collective enterprise, like when we're doing something we truly believe in with a group of other people. I mean, yes, that could be philanthropy, but that also could be just deeply engaged in conversation at a dinner table, right?
Mhm.
It's just a sense of a lack of self in a way. Some athletes experience flow state, these kind of glimpses of utter and complete awareness of body and space and time. And again, that is the real ease in life that we're looking for. And I think, I can even frame it in a, in a vegetable, let's say. You know, we've all tasted that ethylene gassed tomato that we buy at the supermarket. It tastes like cardboard and water. And then many of us have had the luxury of tasting, that sweet, luscious, bursting tomato that we grew in our own backyard. And that's the real ease that we're looking for. But that tomato didn't come without some degree of inconvenience. We had to cultivate the soil and make some compost and plant the seed and tend it and get it enough water and sun and prune its leaves. And through all of that inconvenience, we have something truly luscious and vibrant and
Mhm.
wonderful in our lives. And, that analogy really can apply more broadly to a lot of areas of life.
Well, I'm curious, what puts you in a flow state?
Yeah. Well, I am a tennis player,
Mhm.
and I'm a very, very amateur pianist. Um, and like we talked about before, I have the pedigree of a banjo player in me. It's these activities that you're doing just for the sake of doing them and not for any kind of future purpose or result. It's being completely all there in the moment, tapped in without attachment to any outcome. And that seems to describe the setting in which that experience of flow state can occur. When I am, listen, I'm a pretty good tennis player. I played in college, but I'm no Roger Federer. But still, I get glimpses of that
Mhm.
where I have an intuition that's so sharpened that I know where my opponent is going to hit the ball before he or she hits it. And that is a signature kind of a flow state that you're transcended your sensory instruments, if you will, and you've tapped into something bigger than yourself. You become a conduit for some greater intelligence. And you are the ball. You're not really Jeff anymore. You're the entire experience and really just centered upon your conscious self. I find it to be really fascinating. I mean, there's plenty of people that know so much more about flow state, Stephen Kotler, and has a number of really wonderful YouTube videos and TED Talks about flow state. But that essentially the information that we're processing in flow state actually transcends the amount of bits that the brain can actually process. So it's curious because we're tapping into something outside of ourselves, quote unquote, ourselves, um, and that feeling of interconnectedness with the entire universe seems to be that imprimatur of flow state. And of course, the Buddha had this wonderful image for that called Indra's net, in which the entire universe was a massive, never ending cobweb. And at each juncture of that cobweb was a crystalline diamond that reflected every other juncture. This informed kind of his theory of pratitya samutpada in Sanskrit, but of dependent origination, which is basically says that everything is dependent on everything else.
Mhm.
Or this is also echoed in like Japanese aesthetics, or Jiji Muje, or African culture with Ubuntu, essentially this concept of I am because we are. And when
Mhm.
we have a true sensation of we, that seems to push us towards that state of flow.
Well, I think flow is very healing because certainly among the people I work with and myself, the primary injury is to our ability to connect and to feel a part of it.
Mm, yeah.
And that's a phenomenon for many of us, including myself, that heralds the launch of true healing is when you recognize your connection to all life and that you actually belong here, whether you think so or not.
Hmm.
And you can't escape the community of life,
Yeah.
whether you like that or not. It's inescapable. You're part of life.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. Like, we only really feel our pants when they're too tight. You know what I mean? When they're fit just right, we don't even think that they're there.
Same with bras, just so you know.
Fair enough, yeah. My children like to place their training bras on my bed when I had my man boobs. But in the same way that you don't feel your pants when they fit right, you also don't really feel yourself when you fit right. And sometimes I like to actually underscore that idea just kind of through physical sensation. Is like when you experience like turbulence on an airplane or, a close call in traffic and your muscles clutch, right? You have that little spritz of fight or flight and,
Yeah.
cortisol and epinephrine coursing through your veins. That clutch really underwrites this feeling of me as separate, as me as biologically and psychologically threatened, and this is where the aperture of our attention becomes very, very narrow, and we become self-obsessed, and we don't trust the world around us. And that's when we have the greatest sense of me as separate from you. And that serves our biological imperative to survive. So, on some level, that's an adaptive response. But it also really underwrites a sense of separateness. And if you look at people that I believe are experiencing consistent trauma in their lives, there is this sense that they're always in turbulence, right? So there's always a clutch. And yeah, certainly you could analyze that from a neurotransmitter or neurochemical perspective or a hormone perspective. And that's a totally legitimate way to analyze it. And that's where my empirical brain often goes. But there's also a kind of a spiritual, kind of psychological analysis that goes along with that, is that clutch essentially separates Jeff from Anna. And I think, this is why that emotional regulation or kind of that nervous system regulation, which you point to, has so much utility, because it allows us to bring ourselves back to that place of centeredness and connection, where the aperture of attention can open back up, where we can trust the world around us more easily and become less obsessed with self.
Obsession with self is, people will feel upset when I talk about this on my channel, because they're at a range of places where they recognize that we're imprisoned within ourselves when we're in those trauma symptoms. And sometimes there's a tactical way, just, sometimes there's a spiritual way. People come at it in different ways. They might do it with a therapist. Sometimes it's a sudden event happens that puts things in perspective, but it takes practice, practice, practice
Mm-hmm.
to keep coming back. And often I just find the practical means to do that, like meditation. We write before we meditate, because meditation for people with a head like a bag full of cats is quite difficult. So you get the cats over here for a while,
Mm-hmm.
and then you can have a little meditation, and insight comes. And insight, I mean, here's a tidbit about trauma. Early trauma can impair the ability to process thoughts and feelings. So they get jammed up in there. The bag of cats is real. It's not
Mm-hmm.
cats, it turns out, but it's unprocessed thoughts and feelings. And process means to turn something from a charged memory where you're getting that adrenaline and cortisol every time you think about it, until it's a retrievable memory that has no charge. That's processed in a
Mm-hmm.
nutshell. And so, as it happens, I've been a fan and follower and email list person and occasional course taker with your company, Commune, for some years now. So I was excited I got to talk to you, and that we were both Hay House authors was cool. I told you at the beginning of the call, we're cousins. We have the same editor. I'm very pleased about that. But yeah, it looks like such a beautiful place, and I am in awe of your ability to create such a life for yourself, because I know you had a very stressful role as head of companies in the past that was just like killing you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's clear to see that this is enlivening you, and something really good is happening there. Can you tell us about that professional journey?
As I alluded to kind of briefly when we started, I really following my muse, which is my wife, my better three quarters, Skylar, into starting this very large company, or what became a very large company called Wanderlust. And I really placed a lot of my self-worth within the context of what I did at that company. Essentially, my identity was very anchored to my position as CEO of Wanderlust and how big could I grow it. And of course, along the way was, working 16 hours a day and on flights 200 days a year and, committing carbicide and, living coffee, coffee to wine o'clock, et cetera, all those things. And that's really what, pushed me to those physical symptoms that I outlined before. But really that experience of running Wanderlust has its provenance more in my childhood. I was being kind of dragged around by my parents on a very peripatetic upbringing. So I lived in 12 different places by the time I was 7. And, I was a very chubby kid, and I was getting moved to a new country and a new school and having to assimilate and kind of squirm my way in to new cliques of friends. And children will always sacrifice every authentic aspect of themselves for the sake of connection. So my goal as a kid was simply to try to be liked, and I would do anything in that quest. I was learning like new languages as quickly as I possibly could. I was trying to adopt sort of cultural affectations as quickly as I possibly could. I was using all of my mirror neurons kind of unwittingly to try to make friends. And that was very, very, very difficult because I was always the outsider and I didn't fit in. And that really, and I have some funny stories that I write about in the book about that, but, that really informed a lot of my adult behavior. I became an incessant, perpetual people pleaser. So much so that I almost adopt the affectations and accents of every single person that I'm with. And so my wife teases me because I also host a podcast, and I'll, be interviewing Wim Hof, and all of a sudden I'll take on like a Dutch burr of like, okay, Wim, now tell me what it's like to die. And I'm like, what is going on? Or I've interviewed, Deepak many times, and I'm like, okay, Deepak, please tell me what. I mean, and it's actually an adaptive, sort of bottom up, involuntary response for the sake of connection. But it really had a lot of detrimental downstream impacts as I grew older because I carried that kind of rucksack of always needing to be liked into my adulthood. And I really became the story that I constantly told myself about myself, that I was still that chubby kid who would never really be liked, who would do anything to belong, and whose genetic fate was sort of written in the stars. And and a lot of my health journey or my transformation was based in this awakening that actually change is truly possible and that you can tell yourself a new story about yourself.
Yeah, in your book, you talked about the identity of somebody who, I just don't have a good metabolism.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, we've been taught that metabolism is something that you quote unquote have.
Hmm.
I think I compared it to an ugly sweater that you have in your closet. Through interviewing 350 to 400 doctors over the last 5 or 6 years, kind of as part of my own transformation, I realized that metabolism is actually a very, very dynamic process. It's not something that you have, it's not a product, it's a process. And yes, there are some genetic determinants that can predispose you a little bit here and there to having a slower or faster metabolism, but those variances or variations are very, very small. Actually, what the science is pointing to now is that between the ages of 20 and 60, our metabolism actually barely slows down. And so as I began to kind of understand metabolism and candidly all the processes of the body as constantly changing in relation to their environment, then that gave me a greater sense of agency through changing my behavior and altering my environment where possible. That metabolism and disease was just a process, and I had significant power to alter the trajectory of that process towards wholeness. That's the process of healing, or towards disconnection and disease. That's the process of ailing. And that was a really big awakening for me. And this is kind of the message that I want everyone to take home. Sure, there's like tons of protocols and mechanisms of action associated with those protocols, but atop of that is that change is not only possible, it's all that's happening. It's all that's happening. Every single one of us is a collection of 7 octillion atoms experiencing 37 billion chemical reactions per second. I am simply not the same guy that started this podcast, and neither are you, and neither is anyone listening. We are impermanent, and we are constantly changing in relationship to our environment, period. In fact, you cannot separate your behavior and function from the behavior and function of your environment. You are an environism. You are an organism.
And an environism.
Yeah. And
Exposome was a word you mentioned that I was intrigued by.
yeah, exposome was I think a term that was introduced to me through Mark Hyman, and it really speaks to this same idea. I mean, exposome is essentially the sum of all the environmental inputs in your universe. So everything that you eat, all the air that you breathe, how you move through life, your relationships are a huge part of it. Where you live, etc. And it is really the exposome that is the largest determinant of chronic disease. Yes, we are sometimes predisposed, sometimes definitively, to disease, through our genetics. But if you look at chronic disease, cancer, dementia, diabetes, heart disease, the big ones, those are largely determined by the exposome, essentially the sum of all of the inputs in our environment. And again, we don't have full control over our exposome, but when we, take stock, there are plenty of ways that we can alter our environment and by extension, alter ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's one reason why it's so important change that we understand change to be possible and not to get too identified either with the disease or the trauma state. And it was one reason why, for many years, it helped me to say I'm an adult child of an alcoholic. And after that, it became helpful to stop saying that because I'm so much more than that. That's a historical fact. It's biographical, not now.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, you can't change the fact that something may have happened, right? But you can change your emotional and psychological response to that thing right now. That's where you have a degree of agency. And, I think like what you pointed to earlier, there's a bidirectional integrated relationship between our physiology and our psychology. we often think about our physiology changing in relation to our psychology, right? Like we see a rattlesnake on the path and, whoa, oh my God, our heart rate and respiratory rate increase, we go into fight or flight. But the opposite is also very, very true. We have kind of somatically these wounds, these unprocessed wounds that become stuck, like
Mhm.
Michael Singer, I think, calls them samskara, but that actually have tremendous impact on our psychology. They're
Mm.
stuck in there, and then they mold and shape our our neurochemicals, but certainly like the stories that we tell every day about ourselves and our behavior and our knee-jerk reactions to things. And so this is, again, I think, where you point to this, like whether it's somatic experiencing or internal family systems or cognitive behavioral therapy or meditation, pick your tool, but being able to metabolize stress in the same way that you metabolize carbohydrates, or catabolize, really, in some cases, break them down into their component parts so you can, blow them out.
Mhm.
Um, this is, this is the work of a lifetime.
Yeah, well, you can make very rapid progress quickly on this trauma dimension as just as you can on the purely physical one.
True.
You
Yeah,
can
it
start to
is a.
feel better like today.
That's true. That's a great point, and I probably should qualify it's the work of a lifetime because it can be the work of a lifetime, but like you said, like upward spirals are so available. It's
Yeah.
really quite amazing. We tend to associate our physiological and psychological health with downward spirals
Mhm.
because that's what we often see and hear about. But upward spirals are really just as available, and they can happen quite quickly. And the momentum that you can start to experience in relation to these upward spirals in life is addictive and
It's
efflorescent,
fun.
and
It's
yeah,
fun.
it's fun. Yeah.
It's a joy. It brings new excitement. They have this saying, I used to go to 12-step meetings for families of alcoholics, and they have this phrase in there of beyond your wildest dreams.
Mm.
And my wildest dreams, when my whole healing journey began, I hate that phrase, healing journey. It sounds so corny, and it sounds so like, and then you get there,
Right.
but
Yeah.
it's an upward spiral.
There's no
It's a way of,
terminus.
yeah, yeah, there's no end. And then one day you think you have it all together and you don't. And, but beyond your wildest dreams at the time, I thought, oh gosh, if I could just have a boyfriend. And I always laugh and go, and I had many, and then some
Hmm.
husbands, and still I grow. And still my dreams get wilder. And so you don't even know, if you've never been well, you can't even imagine what it is. And so it is like this exciting journey to find out. And I find it comforting that there's a brake pedal and a gas pedal on the whole thing. I can stop using my common sense techniques. I can stop the whole thing. And I've evidently needed to do that at times. I just gave up on taking care of
Hmm.
myself sometimes and
Hmm.
had that experience, and then came back and had that experience of the difference. And that's, people often say, how can I, keep to good habits? And I go, pain, I guess, where it be, you just know what it's costing you to not do it. And it feels, you remember
Mm.
how good it felt to take care of yourself, and you do that. I wondered, can you tell me a little bit about like what are the most important things for a person to do to start supporting their metabolism?
It's funny, you brought up something right there that triggered a memory that I have not had in since it happened, just right now. Do you know Gabby Bernstein, probably, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. She's also a Hay House author.
Uh-huh.
I was sitting on a panel with her at Wanderlust. This must have been 12 years ago, maybe. And we were in a room that was packed, must have been 400, 500 people. And she looked, she's like, Jeff, this is such a success. Is this what you always dreamed of? And I stopped and I looked at her and I said, you know, Gabby, I never made it this far in my dreams.
Yeah.
And I think that now I would have never said that. You know, now my my heart imagines a world that is possible, but I don't know what that quite is. But I know it's attainable. It's out there for me, and that is a real massive transformation. Anyways, you just talking about that. You just brought that up for me. Thank you for that. Yeah, in terms of things that you can do to upregulate your metabolism, you know, for me, I was in a relatively dire situation. So there were three very specific protocols that I adopted, which I categorize as good stress. And really, what they do is they mimic really the conditions in which we evolved. So they are kind of Paleolithic stressors that were just the normal conditions of life for 200,000 years on the Serengeti. You know, life has really changed quite significantly in the last 150 years, but particularly in the last 50 years. And these were just self-imposing a degree of calorie scarcity in my life. So we often know that as fasting or really time-restricted eating. It doesn't necessarily have to mean calorie scarcity because you can certainly eat 10 pizzas in a very short period of time. But, you know, I basically consolidated all my consumption of food in an 8-hour window. I also then started a very dedicated cold plunging protocol. And for me, that was probably the most difficult because even the mere sight of a snow informed lake would be enough to kind of elicit a panic attack normally. But I started to cold plunge. Wim Hof actually did come to my house for a few weeks and got me into the ice. And then, you know, I started a resistance training kind of regimen. But I did those things and I kind of toyed around with them in different ways. And then I ended up finding it like a very, very specific cadence for how to do it to have the most maximum benefit on my metabolism.
I'm
Um,
scared to ask. I'm scared to ask because I know it
yeah,
would be good for me, and I'm really scared of it.
yeah. I mean, you're scared to ask about the, oh, well,
Like,
yeah,
how much do you have to get? Oh, in ice water? Oh god.
yeah. Well, listen, here's the thing. And, you know, we're all bio individuals. Yes, we do share 99.9% of the same DNA. So I do feel that there are mechanisms within our organism that we all share to some degree. But I do want to caveat this that, you know, men and women are different and we have different hormones, certainly different stages of life. And so I really recommend that everyone experiments and finds their own way to do things. But for me, consolidating all my consumption of food in an 8-hour window was key because after 15 and a half hours, my blood glucose would be pretty low. You know, I also adopted a kind of very low glycemic kind of ketotarian diet. And so about 10:30 in the morning before eating my first bite of food, I would get into a cold plunge. And the cold doesn't have to be that cold. It actually just needs to feel a little bit uncomfortable to confer a benefit. So people don't have to get into a 34-degree plunge with little ice pellets floating on the top of it. In fact, I would never recommend that. You don't want to run a marathon if you've never run before. You know, just ease into the edge of your discomfort. So a 58 or 60-degree plunge or shower is totally fine. But I would do that before I broke fast. And when you do that, there's a physiological phenomenon in which your core body temperature plummets. And you know your body is engineered to always find the Goldilocks zone. So in order to bring my core body temperature back into that warm porridge of 98.6, it had to make heat And in order to make heat, your body needs an energy substrate, right? So we use two different energy substrates as humans. We use glucose and we use fat. But because I had a very low glycemic diet and because I was 15 and a half hours fasted at the time that I got in the cold plunge, there was not a lot of available glucose for my mighty mitochondria to use. And so it had to use fat. It had to oxidize triglycerides in my adipocytes, essentially break down fat into free fatty acids and use that substrate to make myself warm. And so if weight management is one of your foci, that combination between a low glycemic diet, a fasting protocol, and a well-timed cold plunging protocol had incredible impacts on me. I could almost really watch the weight disappear, and I lost 65 to 70 pounds over a very short period of time, like 3 months, 3 to 4 months.
Wow. You make it sound actually quite attractive. I've gotten as far as cold showers, but no ice.
Yeah, cold
And
showers is great. You just want to end cold.
yeah.
And, we have these incredible mechanisms, in our body to find homeostasis. Like one is called shivering. I think people have
Mhm.
heard of that one before. It's not a
Yeah.
very clinical term. The
Yeah.
other one is called sweating.
I've done that.
One helps you warm up and one
Check.
helps you cool down.
Yeah.
Right? But when we live in these thermo-neutral environments where there's this, little digital box on the wall that knows exactly how Anna likes it, you
Yeah.
know,
At the right
w-
time of day.
at the right time of day, we really don't leverage these hard-wrought evolutionary mechanisms that, we developed over hundreds of thousands of years. So this is why you have to now self-impose a little bit of good stress. You got to make
Yeah.
yourself a little uncomfortably hot and a little uncomfortably cold. And by doing that, what you're really doing is enhancing your body's own ability to find homeostasis. And of course, this is true for psychology too, because moving back to the middle, to psychological homeostasis or centeredness, is also the key to psychological health. And so, we really can see health within that greater framework of how refined is my capacity to foster balance in my organism. That's the biggest question you can ask, you know, because balance really just is the signature of health in every system, not just human physiology, but also in ecology, economics, politics,
Right.
etc. Yeah.
Right. And to not get stuck out there on the edges.
Yeah.
That is
Where-
what it's like to have PTSD. It is
Mm,
stuck on the edges.
yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So we now know that mental health is tied to the metabolism and metabolic disorders, and that changing these things can affect mental health about quite serious diagnoses. Even I've seen studies,
Hmm.
and so this is not like a side thing for people who have trauma related problems.
No, I mean, this is not a study that I know a tremendous amount about, but I think it was cited in Gabor Mate's book, and I believe, the woman, Rachel Yehuda, who studies epigenetics,
Mhm.
particularly like in the Jewish communities in Ohio, et cetera. But there was the great kind of Montreal ice storm, and they had studied a number of women who were pregnant during this storm that caused power outages for weeks upon weeks. And then they were followed the progeny of the women that were pregnant during that time. And that stress and trauma during pregnancy actually led to a disproportional predisposition towards metabolic disease in the
Mhm.
kids.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, there is no separating, you
Mhm.
know, what we experience from a psychological perspective, but also the hormones and neurotransmitters that are associated, with those psychological experiences from our physiology. In fact, we know that most often, traumatic events are generally characterized by a spike of adrenaline or epinephrine. That's
Mm-hmm.
how we actually remember them. That's how they get actually baked in
Mm-hmm.
to our synaptic connections. And so, like, if I were to ask almost anyone on the street, like, give me a memory from your childhood, it's not going to be like, oh, yeah, I remember when my dad took me out that one afternoon and we got ice cream and we lay on the grass and it was just wonderful. It's probably not going to be that. It's probably like, oh, I got into this car accident when I was 7, you know, or something much worse. Because, it is that relationship between events and neurochemistry that often anchor or cement that experience. And, again, these are the targets of a tremendous amount of work as we get older.
Yeah. Well, I'm very intrigued. A friend of the family has schizophrenia,
Hmm.
and I remember, especially during the pandemic, because very close friend of the family, all the kids were lonely. All the kids, well, most of them were getting heavily into weed. All the kids were committing carbicide, as you called it. I love that term.
Hmm.
It was it was crazy times, and they all the kids got pushed to the edges of what their mental health could bear. And I sometimes wonder. And there had been other traumas, and there was a genetic predisposition. But as I was studying in your book, that gene expression is not a given. Genes may be there, but they will not be expressed necessarily unless they're washed in these experiences and the daily trauma of what people go through, and
Hmm.
whether it's a horrible job or they were locked down or they're in a community full of division and shouting and cruelty to by group. And these are huge traumas, and we focus on specific ones like for children, but they keep going. They
Hmm.
keep going. And so becoming resilient against that is what interests me. So you talk about good stress, that there's a
Hmm.
good kind of stress that makes us stronger. It does that rather than break us down.
Yeah. We often understand this by dint of kind of the most obvious example. So we'll go to the gym and we'll overload a biceps muscle, for example, with heavy weight and lots of repetitions. And really what's happening there is you're tearing the microfibers in said muscle. And then you have an immune response, an inflammatory response to that injury, and your body summons these awesome structural proteins, myosin and actin, and you give yourself enough rest and you eat enough protein, and what happens? You'll notice that muscle grows back bigger and stronger. And so that's kind of one of the most obvious examples of good stress is muscle hypertrophy. It's like you stress something, it doesn't kill you, and it makes you stronger. And that is very applicable to a lot of physical mechanisms in the body. So, even if we were to hold our breath for a little while, which I won't suggest that we do on a podcast because that might be a little boring for people, but like there is a adaptive response to that too. We go into a slight state of hypoxia and hypercapnia, which is kind of the abundance of carbon dioxide,
Yeah.
and our body miraculously, or not miraculously, it's engineered to construct more red blood cells, which of course are the couriers of oxygen to your cells for the creation of energy. So a shortage of oxygen actually creates more oxygen couriers. This is why athletes, Olympians, anyways, train at high altitudes, etc. So the body is just riddled with these adaptive mechanisms to stress.
Mhm.
And, we evolved in relationship to a lot of them. Calorie scarcity was the norm for hundreds of thousands of years. We would have a wonderful harvest in the late summer and early fall. We'd gorge on copious amounts of glucose. We might put on a little belly fat. That was actually completely adaptive. There was no Instagram, right? So no judgment happening. In fact, you wanted it because the paucity of winter was just around the corner. And that calorie scarcity not only kept us lean, but now, as we've discovered, activated all of these different pathways of resilience and longevity in the body, stimulated this pathway known as AMPK, where we go into autophagy that breaks down kind of the dysfunctional proteins into their amino acid kind of component building blocks, et cetera. There's so many of these very, very positive longevity mechanisms that are triggered through calorie scarcity. But of course, now, you can just go on your app right now. By the time the podcast is over, you can have a summer squash in the middle of winter, or you can have anything ever grown or made at any time. And
Yeah.
so, this is really where, our lifestyle has hijacked, our biology. Now, there is a obviously significant difference between good stress and bad stress.
Mm-hmm.
And the real significant difference is that good stress is acute and very short term and happens in the right dosage. And bad stress does not happen in the right dosage. It's extreme and it's chronic, right? So, if you go back to that metaphor of the rattlesnake on the path, right? You have an adaptive stress response to that serves your biological imperative. You know it when you feel it. Your heart rate and respiratory rate, go up. You go into this fight or flight state. You become self-obsessed, etc. And then the rattlesnake slithers off the path, and what happens? Anna comes back to homeostasis. You just bounce back to the middle. And I think the trickiest part for so many denizens of modernity is that, the rattlesnake really never leaves the path. Through 24-hour news and social media that's algorithmically preferenced to essentially keep you in a state of fight or flight, to overwork and financial hardship and neglect and abuse and racism and go down the line, modernity is really, really good at keeping us in a state of chronic bad stress.
Mm-hmm.
And, this is really where we need to, reframe our relationship with stress and use it to our benefit where we can, and then build up the resilience and the emotional regulatory techniques to tame the wild tiger of bad stress.
Chef Krasno, thank you so much.
You got it.
Wow. I feel personally very inspired by this. It happens to be exactly what I need to hear right now after a very stressful period of my life
Mm,
that's just knocked me on my butt.
mm,
And what good fortune that we met, and I get to hear this and share it with everybody. We tend to find that whatever I'm struggling with, there's like a lot of people in my audience who are right there with me. And I just know, like, trying to have that energy and that ability to get up in the morning and use your mind again, and to not feel like you got hit by a truck every day, and the weight and
mhm.
the food and all the shame about it and all the anger, and that it's just too much right now. We need a way forward from it. Where can people find you?
As it pertains to this book, I was able to scoop up the wonderful URL, goodstress.com. So if you're interested in supporting my work and are inclined to do so, I'd be appreciative if you went over there and bought the book. And the great thing about that is I can bundle in all of these wonderful goodies from all of my big heroes and inspirations like Mark Hyman and Casey Means, who you mentioned before, and Zach Bush and Gabor Mate. My primary gig in life is running a company called Commune, which is really a masterclass platform for well-being. So all of those teachers have graced our platform, and we've made online courses with all of them, generally up at our retreat center in Topanga. And we've created a platform that is the repository of all those courses, and that's at onecommune.com. And I encourage everyone to check that out. It's quite a collection of luminaries. And really, candidly, my work is really just a distillation of the great fortune I've had to be with those people, and to try to synthesize their wisdom and codify it in various different ways.
And you have a terrific podcast as well.
Thanks.
I've
Thanks.
enjoyed it a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. Can't wait to have you on.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
Yeah.
I'm really honored. And I want to come down to the retreat center too. I've always wanted to do that and experience it. It looks lovely. It looks like heaven. And
Yeah.
so
Well,
I like what you,
you'll have to deal with Skylar, my wife. And
okay.
so if you can deal with her, that's also a form of good stress. Yeah. Hopefully she doesn't make it this far in the interview.
All right.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.